The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been in progress for 18 hours. Representatives from 47 species filled the great assembly hall on Harmony Prime, their voices rising and falling in debates that had grown increasingly heated as the hours passed. Dr. Kira Lin sat in the observation gallery, watching the proceedings through a translator interface that converted the dozens of different languages into something she could understand. Beside her, Captain Rextha monitored communications from the Harmony's Edge, which remained in orbit with Jake Morrison and his impossible ship. The debate centered on a single question: what should be done about the human? Counselor Velnara of the Astani Federation was currently speaking, her crystalline form shifting colors as her emotions fluctuated. The being that calls itself Jake Morrison represents a clear and present danger to galactic stability. His ship has demonstrated the ability to absorb and integrate any technology it encounters. What happens when it decides that our ships, our worlds, our very civilizations are resources to be absorbed? Murmurs of agreement rippled through several sections of the assembly. But Counselor Tormek of the Engineering Consortium rose to respond. Honored colleagues, you are allowing fear to cloud your judgment. The human has offered to share advanced defensive technologies that could protect us all from the extinction events he has detected. We should be discussing how to accept his offer, not how to eliminate him. And what proof do we have that these extinction events are real? Demanded Counselor Zextra of the Military Alliance. We have only the word of a being who has undergone unknown transformations and may no longer be capable of rational thought. Dr. Kirillin felt a familiar frustration building in her chest. For hours, the council had been arguing in circles, unable to move past their fear of what Jake represented. Meanwhile, the holographic displays in the assembly hall showed the same data that Jake had shared: 17 different threats approaching inhabited systems, each one capable of wiping out entire civilizations. The debate was interrupted by an urgent communication from the orbital monitoring station. Admiral Kexron, the station commander, appeared on the main display screen with an expression of barely controlled panic. Honored counselors, we have an emergency situation developing in the outer system. Long-range sensors have detected a massive object approaching Harmony Prime at significant sublight velocity. The assembly hall fell silent. Admiral Kexron continued his report. The object appears to be artificial in nature, roughly spherical, with a diameter of approximately 2,000 kilometers. Its composition is unknown, but it is emitting energy signatures that match some of the patterns described in the humans' warnings. Counselor Velnara's crystalline form darkened with alarm. Admiral, what is the estimated time until the object reaches our system? Based on current velocity, approximately 14 hours, Counselor. The silence in the assembly hall was absolute. 14 hours to prepare for a threat that they did not understand, using defensive systems that had never been tested against anything of this magnitude. It was Counselor Tormek who finally spoke. Admiral, what recommendations does the Defense Force have for responding to this threat? Admiral Kexron's pause was telling. Honored Counselor, our defensive capabilities are designed to counter known threats from existing civilizations. We have no protocols for dealing with objects of this size and unknown configuration. Dr. Kira Lin felt her communicator vibrate with an incoming message from the Harmony's Edge. She activated the device and heard Jake Morrison's voice, calm and steady despite the crisis. Doctor, I assume the Council is now aware of the approaching object. This is one of the extinction events I warned them about. If they are willing to listen, I may be able to help. She looked down at Captain Rextha, who nodded grimly. Together, they made their way to the speaker's platform, where Rextha requested permission to address the assembly. "Honored counselors," Rextha began, "Captain Jake Morrison is requesting permission to assist with the defense of this system. He claims to have encountered similar threats during his time in the graveyard." The response was immediate and chaotic. Dozens of representatives began speaking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of fear, anger, and desperate hope. It was the senior counselor, an ancient being called Nalthor, whose species was among the oldest in the galaxy, who finally restored order. "Silence!" Nalthor's voice carried the authority of millennia. "We face an unprecedented threat. Pride and politics are luxuries we cannot afford. Captain Rextha, please establish communication with the human." Within moments, Jake's image appeared on the main display screen, but the being who looked back at the assembly was barely recognizable as the human who had been discovered just days before. The energy patterns around his body were now visible even through the communication link, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to encompass vast distances. "Honored counselors," Jake said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the assembly hall. "The object approaching your system is what I call a harvester. It is a semi-biological construct designed to consume entire civilizations and convert their matter and energy into resources for its creators." Counselor Zextra leaned forward aggressively. "And how exactly would you know this, human?" Jake's expression did not change, but the energy patterns around him shifted slightly. "Because I have encountered 7 of them during my journey through the graveyard. Each one was surrounded by the debris of the civilizations it had consumed." The holographic displays around the assembly hall suddenly activated, showing detailed scans of the approaching object. The data had not come from their monitoring stations. It was being transmitted directly from Jake's ship. The harvester operates by deploying smaller constructs that can penetrate planetary defenses and begin the consumption process. Jake continued, "Your current defensive systems are designed to stop ships and missiles. They will have no effect on a threat of this nature." "Then, what do you propose?" asked Counselor Nalthor. "I propose to destroy it," Jake replied simply. "The Defiance has absorbed technologies from multiple civilizations that have faced similar threats. But I will need the cooperation of your defense forces to coordinate the attack effectively." "Counselor." Velnara's form flickered with agitation. "And what guarantee do we have that you will not turn these weapons against us once the immediate threat is eliminated?" Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that seemed to encompass the weight of his entire species' extinction. "Counselor, I am the last human in the galaxy. My species died because they were not prepared for an extinction event. Do you really think I would allow the same thing to happen to the only other intelligent life I have found?" The energy patterns around Jake suddenly expanded, and every being in the assembly hall felt a brief moment of connection with something vast and ancient and utterly determined. "I offer you a choice," Jake said. "You can trust me and perhaps save your civilization, or you can maintain your suspicions and certainly lose it. But understand this. I have spent 6 months surrounded by the wreckage of species that chose pride over survival." He paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that had seen the death of worlds. "I will not let that happen again. With or without your cooperation, I will defend this system. The only question is whether you want to survive as allies or as witnesses." The assembly hall erupted into chaos as representatives argued, pleaded, and demanded answers that no one could provide. But through it all, Jake Morrison waited patiently, his impossible ship holding position in the outer system, ready to face an extinction event that would test everything he had learned about the refusal to die. Time was running out, and the galaxy was about to discover whether cooperation or fear would determine its fate. Zethkara's 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she stared at the console display. The patterns made no sense. She had been monitoring deep space communications for 12 cycles, and nothing like this had ever appeared on her screens before. 2. Signal came from the graveyard of ships, a region of space that no living being was supposed to enter. The area was marked with every warning symbol the Galactic Council could create. Ships that went there never came back. The space itself was broken, twisted by forces that could tear apart matter at the atomic level. Yet here was a signal, clear and strong, growing stronger by the hour. Zethkara pressed her webbed fingers against the translation matrix. The words that appeared on her screen made her breathing slits flutter with confusion. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the UES Defiance. Any station, please respond. Human words. Ancient human language patterns that she recognized from historical archives. But humans had been extinct for 300 years. Everyone in the galaxy knew the story. The human homeworld had been consumed when their star went unstable. The entire solar system had been swallowed by what the scientists called a stellar cascade event. Nothing could survive that kind of destruction. The message, repeated every few minutes, exactly the same each time. But the signal strength kept increasing, which meant whatever was sending it was moving toward them. Zethkara's supervisor, Commander Veltar, was a tall being with gray skin and eyes that saw deeper into the light spectrum than most species. When she called him over to her station, his expression grew darker with each passing moment. "This is impossible," Veltar said, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones of his species. "Run a full analysis. Check for signal degradation, time displacement, or artificial construction." Zethkara's fingers danced across her console. Theta. Advanced systems of Nexus Prime were designed to detect any kind of deception or technical manipulation. But every test came back the same way. The signal was real, current, and definitely coming from something moving through the graveyard. "Commander," Zethkara said carefully, "the signal appears to be genuine. The transmission patterns match human communication protocols from their final historical period. The physics of the carrier wave are consistent with their technology level." Veltar was quiet for a long time. Around them, the monitoring station continued its normal operations. Hundreds of communication specialists from dozens of species tracked signals across the galaxy, watching for threats, coordinating trade, and maintaining the fragile peace between worlds. But this signal was different. This signal suggested that something everyone knew to be impossible was actually happening. "What do the historical records say about this Captain Morrison?" Veltar asked. Zethkara pulled up the human archives. The files were extensive but sad to read. They told the story of a species that had been just beginning to reach for the stars when cosmic forces beyond their control had ended their existence. "There are several humans named Morrison in the military records," she reported, "but none listed as a captain of a ship called Defiance. The UES prefix matches their military naming system, but I cannot find this specific vessel in any database." The signal came again exactly as before, but this time there was something else with it. A faint secondary transmission that their equipment had not detected before. "Commander, I am reading additional data streams buried in the signal. They appear to be navigation logs." Veltar moved closer to her console. What do they say? Zethkara worked to decode the information. Human data storage was primitive compared to modern standards, but the patterns were clear enough. What she found made her breathing slits seal shut in shock. The logs show a journey of 6 months through what the human calls the deep dark. They list encounters with debris fields containing technology from species I have never heard of. Some of these material signatures predate the Council by thousands of years. The commander's eyes shifted to colors that indicated deep concern. That is not possible. Nothing survives in the graveyard for more than a few hours. The spatial distortions alone would destroy any known material. As if responding to their conversation, the signal changed. Instead of the standard message, a new transmission came through. This is Captain Morrison again. I know someone is out there. My sensors show a monitoring station about 2 days away. I have been alone for a very long time. Please respond. Zethkara and Veltar looked at each other. The human was detecting them from inside the graveyard, across distances that should make such detection impossible. His ship was not only surviving the impossible conditions, it was operating sensor equipment that could penetrate the very barriers that protected them. We need to contact the Council immediately, Veltar said. This situation is beyond our protocols. But before he could issue the order, another message came through. This one was different. The voice was the same, but there was something else mixed with the words. A harmonic resonance that seemed to make the station's hull vibrate in sympathy. I understand if you are afraid to answer. The graveyard is dangerous, and humans are supposed to be extinct. But I am real, and I am coming your way whether you want me to or not. I suggest we talk before I arrive. The transmission ended, but the harmonic resonance continued for several seconds afterward. Instruments across the monitoring station registered the effect. Whatever was generating that signal was doing things to space itself that their science could not explain. Veltar activated the emergency communication array. Within minutes, he was speaking directly to the Council headquarters on the central world of Harmony. Honored counselors, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. We are receiving communications from a human claiming to be the captain of a ship currently traveling through the graveyard of ships. The signals appear genuine, but this should be impossible given the known extinction of the human species and the lethal nature of that region of space. The response from the Council was swift. Emergency protocols were activated. The science vessel Harmony's Edge was ordered to investigate, despite the massive risks involved. If there really was a human alive in the graveyard, it represented a discovery that could change everything they thought they knew about survival, extinction, and the nature of space itself. As Zethkara continued monitoring the signals, she found herself thinking about the human histories she had studied. They had been a young species, barely more advanced than the Council's own ancestors when they first reached space. But they had possessed something that the older, wiser species sometimes lacked. They had refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. Now, it seemed that refusal might have saved at least one of them from a fate that should have claimed them all. Dr. Kira Lynn pressed her pale blue hands against the observation deck's transparent aluminum window. Her people came from a world of endless oceans, and the vast emptiness of space usually comforted her. But today, staring into the twisted darkness of the graveyard's edge, she felt only unease. The Harmony's Edge was the most advanced science vessel in the Council fleet. Its crew included representatives from 12 different species, each chosen for their expertise in xenobiology, physics, or first contact protocols. But none of them had ever faced a situation like this. "Doctor, we are approaching the safe distance." "Limit," announced Lieutenant Torgan from the navigation station. His insectoid features clicked nervously as he spoke. Council regulations require us to maintain at least 50,000 kilometers from the graveyard boundary. Kira Lin nodded, but did not move from the window. Understood, Lieutenant. Have we detected any sign of the human vessel? Negative, Doctor. Our sensors show only the usual spatial distortions and debris fields, but the signal strength suggests the source is very close. Captain Rextha of the Harmony's Edge joined Kira Lin at the observation window. The reptilian officer's scales shifted color slightly, indicating concern. Doctor, I must remind you that we are operating under extreme risk conditions. If this human ship truly exists, and if it can survive in the graveyard, then it represents technology far beyond our understanding. Before Kira Lin could respond, the communications officer called out from her station. Captain, we are receiving a direct transmission. The human is attempting to establish contact. Put it through, Rextha ordered. The voice that filled the bridge was definitely human, carrying the distinctive patterns and emotional undertones that their historical files had documented. But there was something else in it now. Something that had not been present in the recordings from Nexus Prime. This is Captain Jake Morrison. I can see your ship on my sensors. Thank you for coming out here. I know this must be confusing and dangerous for you. Kira Lin stepped forward. Captain Morrison, this is Dr. Kira Lin of the Council Science Division. We are here to investigate your situation. Can you provide your current coordinates? There was a pause before Jake responded. Doctor, my coordinates are going to sound impossible. According to my navigation system, I am currently 17 kilometers inside the graveyard boundary. But I am looking directly at your ship, which my sensors say is 52,000 kilometers away. The bridge crew exchanged glances. The mathematics of that statement made no sense. If Jake was inside the graveyard, they should not be able to see him at all. The spatial distortions alone would bend light and electromagnetic radiation in ways that made observation impossible. Captain Morrison, Rextha said carefully, can you describe your vessel's current condition? That is where things get complicated, Jake replied. When I started this journey 6 months ago, I was flying a prototype Earth ship called the Defiance. It was experimental, built for deep space exploration. But it did not look anything like what I am sitting in now. The sensor operator, a multi-limbed being named Vextai, suddenly called out in excitement. Captain, I am detecting something on the long-range arrays. It appears to be... I am not sure how to describe this. The main display screen flickered to life, showing a composite image from their most powerful sensors. What they saw made several crew members gasp in shock. A ship was approaching them from the direction of the graveyard, but calling it a ship was like calling a hurricane a breeze. The vessel was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the Harmony's Edge. Its hull appeared to be constructed from hundreds of different materials and technologies, welded and fused together in patterns that should not have been structurally sound. Kira Lin could identify components from at least a dozen different species. There were hull plates that looked like ancient Vorthak design, engine assemblies that resembled early Council prototypes, and weapon systems that appeared to be based on technology she had never seen before. But the most impossible thing about the ship was that it was beautiful. Despite being built from scrap and salvage, every piece fit together perfectly. The mismatched components flowed into each other as if they had been designed as a single unit by a master engineer. Captain Morrison, Kira Lin said slowly, are you seeing what we are seeing? You mean the fact that my ship looks like it was built by a crazy person with access to a 1,000-year-old junkyard? Jake's voice carried a note of humor, but also deep weariness. Yeah, I see it. I have been living with it for 6 months. How is this possible? Rextha demanded. That vessel should not be able to function. The different technologies are completely incompatible. Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more thoughtful. Captain, what do you know about human psychology? Very little, Rextha admitted. Your species was extinct before we developed detailed xenopsychology protocols. Humans have this thing we call stubbornness, Jake explained. When we are told something is impossible, our first instinct is to prove it wrong. When my ship started falling apart in the deep dark, I refused to accept that I was going to die. I started welding on pieces of wreckage, cannibalizing technology from dead ships, rebuilding systems that should not work. Kira Lynn was studying the sensor readings more carefully. Captain Morrison, our analysis shows that your vessel contains technology from species that predate the current galactic civilization. Some of these materials are older than our historical records. The graveyard is full of dead civilizations. Doctor, Jake replied. Ships from species that faced extinction events thousands of years ago. Most of it is just debris, but some pieces are still functional. When you are desperate enough, you learn to make anything work. As they watched, the impossible ship continued its approach. But something strange was happening to the space around it. The normal distortions that marked the edge of the graveyard seemed to be bending away from the vessel, as if the ship itself was somehow protected from the forces that destroyed everything else. Captain Morrison, Kira Lynn said, we need to understand how your ship is achieving this level of integration. The technology you are using should be completely incompatible. Jake's laugh was tired but genuine. Doctor, I think the ship understands things that I do not. When I need something to work, it finds a way to work. When I need to survive something impossible, it becomes possible. I stopped questioning it about 3 months ago. The Harmony's edge shuddered slightly as the human vessel drew closer. Their instruments were detecting energy signatures that did not match any known physics. Whatever was keeping that ship together was operating according to rules that the Council's science had never encountered. Request permission to come aboard for direct communication, Jake transmitted. I think there are some things that are easier to explain in person. Captain Rextha looked at Kira Lynn. The xenobiologist nodded slowly. They had come here to investigate the impossible. Now the impossible was asking to shake their hands. Permission. Granted, Captain Morrison, Rextha said, but we will need to observe full quarantine protocols. Understood, Captain. Fair warning, though. I may not be exactly what you are expecting. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the quarantine chamber, looking exactly like the historical files said a human should look. He was average height for his species, with dark hair, brown eyes, and the kind of face that seemed designed for smiling. But Dr. Kira Lynn noticed that he had not smiled once since coming aboard. The medical scanners hummed around him, taking readings that made the monitoring team whisper nervously to each other. Jake stood perfectly still, letting the machines do their work. He had warned them that he might not be what they expected, but so far he appeared to be completely normal. Too normal. Captain Morrison, Kira Lynn said through the communication system, your cellular structure appears to be standard human baseline, but that should be impossible given your reported exposure to graveyard conditions. Jake looked directly at the observation window where she stood. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them that seemed much older than his apparent age. Doctor, how much do you know about human biology? Enough to know that your species was carbon-based, required oxygen to breathe, and had an average lifespan of roughly 80 years, Kira Lynn replied. Your files indicate you should be approximately 32 years old. That is correct, Jake said. But the files do not include information about what happens to humans when they refuse to die. The chief medical officer, a being called Nexra, whose species specialized in biological analysis, activated the internal communication system. Captain Morrison, please explain what you mean by refuse to die. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone his age. When Earth was destroyed, I was on a test flight in the outer system. The Defiance was an experimental ship, designed to test new, faster-than-light drive systems. When the stellar cascade began, I was far enough away to survive the initial destruction. He paused, and Kirillin noticed that his hands had begun to shake slightly. But surviving the explosion was just the beginning. The cascade effect created a spatial anomaly that pulled everything in the system into what you call the graveyard. My ship was damaged, my life support was failing, and I was looking at a slow death in the middle of nowhere. The medical scanners beeped softly, but the readings they displayed made no sense. Jake's biological functions were perfectly normal, but there were energy patterns in his body that did not match any known life form. That should have been the end of the story, Jake continued. But humans have this problem with accepting reality, when reality is unacceptable. Instead of lying down to die, I started fixing things. When I ran out of spare parts, I used wreckage. When I ran out of food, I found ways to make the recycling systems more efficient. When I ran out of hope, I found new reasons to keep going. Dr. Kirillin was studying the energy readings more carefully. Captain Morrison, our instruments are detecting unusual energy patterns in your cellular structure. Can you explain these? Jake looked up at the observation window again. For the first time, he almost smiled. Doctor, I've been thinking about that for 6 months. The best explanation I can give you is that humans are not very good at staying inside the boundaries of what is supposed to be possible. The scanners suddenly registered a spike in the energy readings, but instead of indicating danger, the patterns seemed to be responding to Jake's emotional state. When he was calm, the energy was barely detectable. When he talked about his experiences, it grew stronger. Nexra leaned forward in excitement. Dr. Kirillin, the energy patterns appear to be integrated into his biological systems. It is as if his entire body has become some kind of hybrid between organic life and pure energy. Is that why your ship is able to integrate incompatible technologies? Kirillin asked. Jake nodded slowly. I think so. When I started adding new components to the Defiance, I expected most of them to fail. But somehow, they worked. Not just worked, but worked better than they should have. It was like the ship was learning from each new piece of technology. He walked over to the chamber wall and placed his hand against the transparent barrier. Where his palm touched the surface, faint lines of light appeared, spreading outward in geometric patterns. The ship responds to what I need, Jake said. When I needed better engines, it figured out how to integrate salvaged drive components from 3 different species. When I needed stronger hull plating, it found ways to bond materials that should have been chemically incompatible. When I needed weapons to defend against the things that live in the deep dark, it built weapon systems that I had never seen before. The light patterns on the barrier were growing brighter. Several crew members backed away from the observation window, but Kirillin pressed closer. Captain Morrison, are you consciously controlling these energy patterns? No, Jake replied. At least, I do not think so. It just happens when I am trying to explain things, like my body is trying to show you what words cannot describe. The patterns suddenly shifted, forming shapes that looked almost like technical diagrams. Kira could see what appeared to be engine designs, hull configurations, and weapon systems. But the technology represented in the light patterns was far beyond anything the Council had developed. Remarkable, Nexra whispered. He is somehow storing and displaying technical information as biological energy patterns. Jake pulled his hand away from the wall, and the lights faded. Doctor, I need you to understand something. I did not choose to become whatever I am now. When my species died, something inside me refused to accept that humans were extinct. Every time I should have died in the graveyard, I found a way to survive instead. Every time my ship should have failed, it found a way to keep going. He sat down on the simple chair provided in the quarantine chamber, suddenly looking very tired. I have been alone for 6 months, surrounded by the wreckage of dead civilizations. The only thing that kept me sane was the belief that somewhere in the galaxy there had to be other life. Other beings who could understand that extinction does not have to be permanent. Kira was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Jake Morrison was not just a human who had survived the impossible. He had somehow become something new, something that represented his species' refusal to accept defeat. "Captain Morrison," she said softly, "what do you plan to do now that you have found us?" Jake looked up at her, and for the first time since coming aboard he did smile, but the expression was sad, determined, and somehow ancient. "Doctor, I plan to make sure that what happened to humanity never happens to anyone else. The galaxy is full of extinction events waiting to happen, but it is also full of species that could survive those events if they knew how." The energy patterns flickered around him again, fainter this time, but somehow more purposeful. "I want to teach people how to refuse to die." The conference room aboard the Harmony's Edge had been modified to accommodate Jake Morrison. The quarantine protocols were still in effect, but the transparent barrier now allowed for easier communication. Jake sat on one side while Dr. Kira and her team occupied the other. For the past 3 hours, Jake had been telling them about his journey through what he called the deep dark. His story was impossible, but the evidence of his survival made it impossible to dismiss. "The first wreck I found was about 2 weeks into my journey," Jake said, his voice steady but distant. "It was huge, easily 10 times the size of my ship. The design was unlike anything in human databases. When I got close enough to scan it, I realized it had been floating there for thousands of years." Lieutenant Vex's Ty, the sensor specialist, leaned forward. "What species did it belong to?" "I never found out," Jake replied. "There were no bodies, no records, no identification, just a dead ship full of technology that I did not understand. But my life support was failing and I needed new air recycling components." He paused, looking down at his hands. "That was when I first noticed that something strange was happening. When I cut into their environmental systems, I expected to find components that would not work with human technology. Instead, I found pieces that seemed to fit perfectly." Dr. Kira had been studying the technical specifications that Jake had provided. "Captain Morrison, the integration patterns you describe violate several fundamental principles of engineering compatibility." "I know," Jake said simply, "but they worked anyway. Not just worked, but worked better than my original equipment. It was like the alien technology wanted to help keep me alive." Nexra, who had been quietly running biological scans throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Captain Morrison, I am detecting significant changes in your energy patterns when you discuss these integration events. Can you describe what you were feeling during these modifications? Jake thought for a moment. Desperate, he said finally. More desperate than I had ever been in my life. I was dying slowly, and the only thing I could do was try to jury-rig alien technology to keep myself breathing for another day. And that desperation somehow enabled the technological integration? Kira Lynn asked. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe it was something else. Humans have always been good at making things work that should not work. We call it improvisation or stubbornness, or just refusing to accept that a problem cannot be solved. He stood up and walked to the barrier, placing both hands against it. The light patterns appeared again, but this time they were more complex, showing detailed technical diagrams of ship systems that seemed to blend technologies from multiple species. The second wreck I found contained pieces from at least 6 different civilizations, Jake continued. Some of the materials were so old that they should have decayed into cosmic dust millions of years ago. But when I integrated them into my ship, they became stronger than ever. The patterns on the barrier shifted, showing what appeared to be a time-lapse sequence of ship modifications. The crew watched in fascination as the simple human vessel gradually transformed into something magnificent and alien. By the 3rd month, I started to realize that the ship was changing faster than I was modifying it, Jake said. I would go to sleep planning one type of repair and wake up to find that the ship had somehow completed a different modification. That worked better than what I had planned. Captain Rextha, who had been silent throughout most of the briefing, finally spoke. Captain Morrison? Are you suggesting that your vessel has achieved some form of artificial intelligence? Jake shook his head. Not artificial intelligence, Captain. Something else. Something that responds to need rather than programming. When I needed better engines, the ship found engine components and figured out how to use them. When I needed stronger weapons, it built weapon systems from salvaged materials. The light patterns on the barrier suddenly changed, showing what appeared to be combat sequences. The crew could see Jake's ship engaging with objects that moved in ways that suggested hostile intent. You encountered aggressive entities in the graveyard? Kira Lynn asked. Things that hunt among the wrecks, Jake confirmed. I do not know what they are or where they came from. They seem to be attracted to functioning technology. The first time they attacked, I thought I was going to die. My weapons were limited, and they had superior numbers. The patterns showed the impossible ship transforming during combat, weapons emerging from its hull that had not been there moments before. But the ship protected itself, Jake continued. More than that, it learned from the attack. After the battle, it absorbed the wreckage of the attackers and integrated their technology. By the 4th month, I was no longer running from these hunters, I was hunting them. Nexera was studying her readings with growing amazement. Captain Morrison, your energy patterns are becoming increasingly complex as you describe these events. It appears that your biological systems are somehow storing detailed technical and tactical information. The ship is not the only thing that has been changing, Jake admitted. I can feel the modifications it makes before they happen. When it needs a new type of engine, I somehow know which wreck will have the right components. When it builds new weapons, I understand how to use them, even though I have never seen the technology before. He pulled his hands away from the barrier, and the patterns faded. But this time, faint traces of light remained, as if the energy was becoming a permanent part of the barrier itself. Dr. Kira Lynn, I need you to understand something important, Jake said, his voice becoming more serious. The graveyard is not just a dumping ground for dead ships. It is a testing ground. Every species that achieves space travel eventually faces extinction events. Some survive, some do not. The ones that do not end up in places like the graveyard. And you believe that your survival represents some kind of evolutionary adaptation? Kiralyn asked. I think humans developed something that most other species do not have, Jake replied. We developed the ability to refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. When faced with extinction, most species either fight and die or give up and die. Humans fight and adapt. He sat back down, but the energy patterns continued to flicker around him like a faint aurora. The ship and I have become something new, Doctor. Something that can take the best qualities of dead civilizations and use them to prevent future extinctions. We have become a bridge between what was and what could be. Kiralyn looked around the room at her crew. Each of them was from a different species, each representing a different approach to survival and adaptation, but none of them had ever encountered anything like what Jake Morrison had become. Captain Morrison, she said finally, what do you intend to do with these abilities? Jake's answer was simple but carried the weight of absolute conviction. I intend to make sure that the galaxy never runs out of second chances. The alarm started screaming at exactly 14:47 ship time. Dr. Kiralyn was in the middle of reviewing Jake's biological scans when the red lights began flashing throughout the Harmony's edge. All stations, red alert. Captain Rextha's voice echoed through the ship. Multiple hostile contacts approaching from deep space, unknown configuration and intent. Kiralyn rushed to the observation deck, where Jake was already standing at the quarantine barrier. His calm expression had been replaced by something much more intense. The energy patterns around his body were brighter than she had ever seen them. Captain Morrison, do you know what we are facing? She asked. Jake's eyes were focused on something beyond the ship's hull. Devourers, he said quietly. I have encountered them before. They are attracted to advanced technology and life signs. They do not negotiate, they do not retreat, and they do not leave survivors. Through the observation windows, Kiralyn could see shapes emerging from the darkness of space. They were sleek, organic-looking vessels that moved with a fluidity that suggested biological rather than mechanical propulsion. There were at least a dozen of them, each one roughly the size of the Harmony's edge. Captain Rextha, Jake called out through the communication system. You need to get your people away from here immediately. Your ship is not equipped to handle this kind of threat. Rextha's voice came back strained. Captain Morrison, we are a Council science vessel. We have defensive capabilities. Not against these things, Jake replied. His hands were pressed against the quarantine barrier, and the light patterns were spreading across the entire surface. Captain, please trust me. Get your ship to minimum safe distance and prepare for emergency jump if necessary. The first energy beam from the Devourers struck the Harmony's edge along the port side. The ship shuddered, and several control panels sparked as the alien weapon overloaded their defensive systems. Shields down to 60%, Lieutenant Vextai reported. Their weapons are using some kind of energy-draining technology. Each hit weakens our defenses exponentially. Jake suddenly turned toward the observation deck where Kiralyn stood. His eyes were now glowing with the same energy that surrounded his body. Doctor, I need you to release the quarantine protocols and let me return to my ship. Captain Morrison, that is not safe, Kiralyn protested. Your vessel is outnumbered 12-1. Jake's smile was grim but confident. Doctor, you still do not understand what the Defiance has become. Those ships out there represent a threat to your entire civilization. But they have made one critical mistake. What mistake? Kiralyn asked. They have attacked someone under the protection of the last human. The quarantine field dissolved, and Jake moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a normal human. Within seconds, he was in the docking bay, boarding a small shuttle that would take him back to his ship. As the shuttle launched, another barrage from the Devourers struck the Harmony's edge. This time, the damage was severe. Hull breaches appeared on multiple decks, and the ship's power systems began failing. But then something extraordinary happened. Jake's ship, the Defiance, which had been holding position several kilometers away, suddenly began to change. The mismatched hull plates shifted and rearranged themselves. Weapon systems that had not been visible before emerged from hidden compartments. The entire vessel seemed to expand, becoming larger and more threatening with each passing second. "By the depths," whispered Vextai. "The human ship is transforming itself." The Defiance moved toward the attacking fleet with a grace that defied its size and apparent construction. As it approached the first Devourer vessel, weapons that should not have existed fired energy beams that cut through the alien ship's defenses like they were made of paper. But the most remarkable thing was not the ship's weapons. It was the way Jake seemed to be connected to every system, every weapon, every tactical decision. Through the observation deck cameras, Kira Lin could see him on the bridge of his vessel, but he was no longer entirely human. Energy patterns flowed around Jake's body, connecting him to control interfaces that had not been there when he left the Harmony's edge. He was not piloting the ship so much as becoming part of it, directing its actions through will and instinct rather than traditional controls. The first Devourer exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The Defiance immediately moved toward the debris field and impossibly began absorbing the wreckage. Hull plates from the destroyed enemy ship were integrated into the Defiance's structure within seconds. "The human ship is salvaging enemy technology during combat," Nexra reported in amazement. "Each time it destroys an opponent, it becomes stronger." The remaining Devourers seemed to recognize the threat that Jake represented. They changed formation, attempting to surround the Defiance and overwhelm it with concentrated fire. But Jake and his ship were no longer following normal tactical patterns. The Defiance split apart. What had appeared to be a single vessel suddenly became 3 smaller ships, each one attacking the Devourers from a different angle. But these were not separate vessels. They were extensions of the original ship, connected by streams of energy that allowed them to coordinate their attacks perfectly. Within minutes, half of the Devourer fleet had been destroyed. The surviving ships began to retreat, but Jake did not let them escape. The 3 sections of the Defiance pursued them, hunting them down one by one until only debris remained. Then, as quickly as they had separated, the 3 ships merged back into a single vessel. But the Defiance that returned to the Harmony's edge was different from the one that had left. It was larger, more complex, and studded with weapon systems that had been salvaged from the destroyed Devourers. Jake's voice came through the communication system, but there was something different about it now. It carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the hull of the Harmony's edge itself. "Captain Rextha, Dr. Kira Lin, this is Jake Morrison. The immediate threat has been eliminated, but there will be others. The Devourers travel in large fleets, and they have been feeding on the wreckage in this region for a very long time." When Jake returned to the Harmony's edge, the crew could see that he had changed. The energy patterns were no longer just around his body, they were part of his body. His eyes glowed with a constant inner light, and when he moved, faint traces of energy followed his movements. "Captain Morrison," Kira Lin said carefully, "what happened to you during the battle?" Jake considered the question for a moment. I stopped pretending that I was still entirely human, he said finally. The ship and I have been growing closer for months. During the battle, we finally became what we were meant to be. And what is that? Rextha asked. Jake looked out at the stars, toward the countless civilizations that existed throughout the galaxy. Many of them were young, vulnerable to the same kinds of extinction events that had claimed humanity. Others were old and complacent, unprepared for threats they had never encountered. We are what happens when a species refuses to accept extinction, Jake said. We are adaptation itself, evolution accelerated by necessity and powered by the absolute refusal to give up. He turned back to face the crew, and they could see that his transformation was not complete. He was still changing, still growing into something that the galaxy had never seen before. And we are just getting started. Dr. Kirillin had been studying the new biological scans for 6 hours straight. The data made no sense according to everything she knew about life, consciousness, and the boundaries between organic and inorganic matter. Jake Morrison was no longer entirely human. The energy patterns that had once flickered around his body were now integrated into his cellular structure. His DNA showed modifications that should have been impossible without massive genetic engineering. But the changes were not artificial. They appeared to be the result of some kind of accelerated evolutionary process. Doctor, Nexra called from across the medical bay, you need to see these neurological readings. Kirillin moved to the secondary monitoring station, where brain scan data scrolled across multiple displays. What she saw made her breathing slits, flutter in shock. His neural activity is operating on 17 different frequency bands simultaneously, Nexra explained. Normal human brain function uses 3, maybe 4 bands at most. But Captain Morrison appears to be processing information on levels that we cannot even measure accurately. Is he still conscious in the way we understand consciousness? Kirillin asked. That is what makes this so remarkable, Nexra replied. He is not just conscious, he is hyperconscious. He appears to be aware of quantum-level interactions in his environment, electromagnetic patterns across vast distances, and temporal variations that suggest he can perceive events slightly before they happen. Through the observation window, they could see Jake standing in the modified quarantine chamber. But he was not alone. Holographic displays surrounded him, showing technical diagrams, star charts, and data streams that seemed to flow directly from his mind to the ship's computer systems. Captain Rextha joined them at the observation station. Dr. Kirillin, we have received priority communications from Council headquarters. Word of Captain Morrison's existence has reached the highest levels of government. Kirillin looked up from the scan data. What is their response? Mixed, Rextha replied carefully. Some council members see him as a potential ally, a being with capabilities that could benefit all of galactic civilization. Others view him as a threat that needs to be contained or eliminated before he becomes too powerful. In the quarantine chamber, Jake suddenly turned toward the observation window. His glowing eyes seemed to focus directly on Captain Rextha. Captain, Jake's voice came through the communication system. I can hear your conversation. The modifications to my sensory systems include enhanced audio reception across multiple frequency ranges. Rextha stepped closer to the communication panel. Captain Morrison, how much of our discussion were you able to hear? All of it, Jake replied. And I understand the Council's concerns. What I have become represents something that their political and scientific frameworks are not equipped to handle. He gestured toward the holographic displays around him, and they shifted to show what appeared to be a map of the galaxy with thousands of marked locations. But while they are debating whether I am a threat, I have been using my expanded awareness to scan deep space for other dangers. What I have found should concern them much more than my existence. The holographic map zoomed in on specific regions, showing areas of space that glowed with ominous red markers. There are 17 different extinction-level events developing across the galaxy, Jake continued. Stellar cascade events like the one that destroyed Earth. Technological singularities that are consuming entire star systems. Biological plagues that are spreading between worlds faster than any quarantine can contain them. Dr. Kirillin stared at the display in horror. Captain Morrison, are you certain of these predictions? They are not predictions, Doctor. They are observations. My enhanced perception allows me to see patterns across vast distances and timescales. These events are already in progress. The only question is whether galactic civilization will be prepared when they reach populated systems. Jake walked closer to the barrier, and the energy patterns around him intensified. This is why the ship and I had to evolve beyond normal human limitations. The galaxy does not need another species that can be wiped out by cosmic accidents. It needs something that can survive any threat and help others do the same. Captain Rextha was studying the holographic display with growing alarm. Captain Morrison, if what you are showing us is accurate, the Council needs to be informed immediately. The Council will not believe the warnings coming from me, Jake replied. I am an impossible human flying an impossible ship, making impossible claims about threats they cannot detect with their current technology. He paused, looking directly at each of them through the observation window. But there is something they might believe, something that could prove that cooperation with me is not just beneficial, but necessary for the survival of everything they have built. The holographic displays around Jake shifted again, showing detailed technical specifications for advanced defensive technologies. The designs were unlike anything in the Council's databases, but they appeared to be based on principles that were theoretically sound. I am offering to share the knowledge that the ship and I have accumulated, Jake said. Technologies salvaged from dead civilizations, combined and improved through processes that normal science cannot replicate. Defensive systems that can protect against the extinction events that are coming. Nexra leaned forward, studying the technical data with professional interest. Captain Morrison, these designs appear to incorporate adaptive elements. They would be able to modify themselves to counter new types of threats. Exactly, Jake confirmed. This is what I learned from 6 months in the graveyard. The civilizations that died were often more advanced than the ones that survived them, but they lacked the ability to adapt quickly enough when faced with unprecedented threats. Dr. Kirillin was beginning to understand the magnitude of what Jake was offering. Captain Morrison, you are proposing to teach the galaxy how to survive extinction events by becoming more adaptable. I am proposing to give the galaxy what humanity learned too late, Jake replied. The knowledge that survival is not about being stronger or smarter than the threats you face. It is about being more stubborn than those threats, more willing to change, to adapt, to become something new, if that is what survival requires. The energy patterns around Jake suddenly expanded, filling the entire quarantine chamber with soft, pulsing light. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics. That seemed to resonate through the hull of the ship itself. The Council can choose to see me as a threat, Doctor. But if they do, they will be making the same mistake that destroyed my species. They will be assuming that the universe cares about their plans, their politics, or their comfort zones, the they. Light patterns coalesced into new holographic displays, showing simulations of the approaching extinction events and how they could be countered with the technologies Jake was offering. The universe does not care about any of those things. It only cares about one question. When faced with impossible odds, will you adapt or will you die? Jake's gaze moved from one crew member to another, and each of them felt the weight of that question. I have already given my answer. Now the galaxy must give theirs. In the silence that followed, Dr. Kira Lin realized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just first contact with a surviving human, but the emergence of something entirely new, something that represented evolution itself, accelerated by necessity and driven by the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The question was whether the galaxy would be wise enough to accept the help being offered, or whether pride and fear would lead them to reject the one thing that might save them all. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. 24 species voted to trust Jake Morrison. 23 voted against. It was Counselor Nalthor who cast the deciding vote, his ancient voice carrying the weight of eons. In my long life, I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have watched species achieve greatness only to be destroyed by their inability to adapt when the universe changed around them. Today, we face such a moment. I vote to accept the humans' offer. 6 hours remained until the Harvester reached Harmony Prime's orbital defense perimeter. Jake Morrison had spent those hours working with the Council's military commanders, sharing tactical information and coordinating defensive strategies that pushed the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about warfare. Dr. Kira Lin watched from the bridge of the Harmony's edge as the impossible ship began its final transformation. The Defiance had grown to 3 times its original size, incorporating materials and technologies that Jake had been holding in reserve. Weapon systems emerged from its hull like flowering plants reaching toward sunlight. Doctor, Nexra said from her monitoring station, Captain Morrison's biological readings are off our scales. He appears to be interfacing directly with every system on his ship simultaneously. Through the view screen, they could see Jake on the bridge of the Defiance, but he was no longer recognizable as the human who had first come aboard their ship. Energy flowed around him like liquid light, connecting him to control interfaces that spanned the entire vessel. His eyes had become points of pure brilliance, and when he moved, reality itself seemed to bend slightly around him. The Harvester appeared on long-range sensors as a dark sphere that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As it approached, smaller objects began separating from its surface. The consumption drones that would strip away planetary defenses and begin the harvesting process. Admiral Kexeron's voice came through the communication system. All ships, this is Fleet Command. The enemy has deployed initial attack units. Estimated count is over 10,000 individual drones. The Council fleet consisted of 200 ships, their most advanced vessels, equipped with the best weapons and shields their technology could provide. Under normal circumstances, they would have been a formidable force. But against 10,000 drones backed by a construct the size of a small moon, they seemed pitifully inadequate. That was when Jake Morrison showed the galaxy what humanity's refusal to accept defeat truly meant. The Defiance did not move toward the enemy fleet in the conventional sense. Instead, it seemed to fold space around itself, appearing simultaneously in dozens of different locations throughout the combat zone. Each manifestation of the impossible ship engaged multiple enemy drones, weapons firing in patterns that seemed to anticipate the enemy's movements before they made them. But the most remarkable thing was not Jake's tactical abilities. It was his coordination with the Council fleet. Through means that their science could not explain, he was somehow sharing his enhanced perception with every ship in the defense force. Captain Rextha felt it first as a gentle pressure in his mind, then as a flood of tactical information that allowed him to see the battle from perspectives that should have been impossible. He could perceive enemy movements before they happened, identify weaknesses in their formations, and coordinate with other ships with a precision that no communication system could achieve. Across the fleet, the same phenomenon was occurring. Pilots who had never worked together were flying in perfect formation. Gunners were hitting targets at ranges that exceeded their equipment's capabilities. Ships were moving through the battle space with a coordination that seemed almost choreographed. The enemy drones, designed to overwhelm defenders through superior numbers, found themselves facing a defense that anticipated their every move. For every drone that was destroyed, the defending fleet seemed to become more efficient, more coordinated, more deadly. But the real battle was between Jake and the Harvester itself. As the massive construct approached the inner system, Jake's ship grew larger and more complex, absorbing wreckage from destroyed drones and incorporating their technology in real time. The Defiance became something that had never existed before, a vessel that was simultaneously one ship and many ships, a single mind directing thousands of weapon systems, a living example of adaptation in action. The Harvester responded by deploying larger weapons, energy beams that could vaporize entire battleships in seconds. But Jake did not try to withstand these attacks. He flowed around them using the same spatial manipulation techniques that had allowed him to survive in the graveyard. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Harvester was nothing but expanding debris, and the drone swarm had been completely eliminated. But Jake Morrison and his impossible ship had paid a price for the victory. Dr. Kiralyn was among the first to board the Defiance after the battle. What she found there made her question everything she thought she understood about the nature of consciousness and identity. Jake was still on the bridge, but he was no longer entirely corporeal. The energy patterns that had once surrounded his body now extended throughout the entire ship. He was the ship, and the ship was him, fused together in a way that made it impossible to determine where the human ended and the vessel began. "Doctor," Jake's voice came from speakers throughout the bridge, but also seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Thank you for coming." "Captain Morrison," Kiralyn said carefully, Are you still human?" Jake's laughter seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I am what humans become when they refuse to accept that anything is impossible. I am adaptation itself, evolution accelerated by necessity." Holographic displays around the bridge showed maps of the galaxy, with markers indicating the locations of other extinction events that were still developing. But now, there were also new markers, symbols indicating defensive installations that were already under construction. "The Council has agreed to establish the Persistence Protocol," Jake explained, "a new organization dedicated to preparing civilizations for extinction events. Ships and crews trained in adaptive survival techniques, technologies that can evolve to meet new threats." "And you will lead this organization?" Kiralyn asked. "I will teach it," Jake replied, "but I will not control it. The galaxy does not need another empire or another ruler. It needs partners in survival, beings who understand that extinction is only permanent if you accept it as such. Through the bridge windows, Kiralyn could see other ships approaching, vessels from dozens of different species, crews who had experienced Jake's shared perception during the battle and wanted to learn more about these adaptive techniques. The impossible ship and the human who should not be alive, Jake said, his voice carrying notes of satisfaction and hope. One story that became the beginning of many stories. Stories of species that learned to survive, to adapt, to refuse defeat even when facing the impossible. The energy patterns around the bridge pulsed gently, and Kiralyn felt a brief moment of connection with something vast and determined and utterly committed to the continuation of life in all its forms. The galaxy is full of extinction events waiting to happen, Jake continued, but now it is also full of beings who know how to refuse to die. That makes all the difference. As Kiralyn left the Defiance and returned to her own ship, she carried with her the knowledge that she had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the survival of humanity's last representative, but the birth of something entirely new. A philosophy of adaptive survival that would spread throughout the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Behind her, the impossible ship held position in orbit around Harmony Prime, no longer just a vessel but a symbol of what could be achieved when intelligence refused to accept defeat. Jake Morrison had kept his promise. He had made sure that extinction was no longer permanent, that adaptation was always possible, and that the galaxy would never run out of second chances. The story of the impossible ship and the human who should not be alive had ended, but the stories of all the species who learned to survive because of his example were just beginning.